There are crimes that shake a community to its core, not simply because of what happened, but because of who stands accused when the truth finally emerges. In the early hours of a winter morning in 1993, in a small Nebraska town, where neighbors knew each other's routines and children played freely in yards bordered by cornfields, a young woman vanished from her own home. Her name was Jennifer Marie Holcomb. She was 24 years old, a mother of two, and by the time the sun rose on that February morning, she had become something else entirely. A mystery that would haunt Lincoln County for more than 2 decades. The investigation that followed would reveal not a stranger lurking in shadows, but something far more disturbing, something that lived inside the walls of that modest ranch house on the edge of town. When the arrest finally came in 2015, it would split the community down the middle and force everyone who had known the family to ask themselves a question they had been avoiding for 22 years. How well do we really know the people we trust most? The town of North Platte sits in the geographic center of Nebraska, where Interstate 80 cuts a straight line through endless farmland, and the wind carries the scent of livestock and turned earth. In 1993, it was a community of roughly 24,000 people. The kind of place where the local newspaper printed birth announcements and high school sports scores on the same page as obituaries, where the biggest employer was the Union Pacific Railroad yards, and where people left their doors unlocked at night because crime felt like something that happened in other places, to other people. The downtown stretched along Front Street with its brick storefronts and painted signs, businesses that had been passed down through generations, hardware stores, diners with red vinyl booths, a movie theater that still used a marquee with removable letters. Beyond the commercial district, neighborhoods spread out in neat grids, modest homes with aluminum siding and chain-link fences, pickup trucks parked in driveways, trampolines in backyards. Winter came hard here. The thermometer dropped below zero for weeks at a time, and snow accumulated in banks along the roads, turning gray with road salt and exhaust. People bundled their children in layers and hurried from heated car to heated building, and the sky stayed low and white from November through March. Jennifer Marie Holcomb had lived in North Platte her entire life. She was born in 1968 at Great Plains Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where her own children would later be born, and she had attended the same schools, shopped at the same stores, knew the same faces that her parents and grandparents had known. Those who knew her said she had been a quiet girl, the kind who smiled easily but didn't draw attention to herself, who worked at the Walmart on South Jeffers Street folding clothes and running the register, saving money for a future that always seemed just out of reach. She had met David Holcomb at a high school football game when she was 17. He was 2 years older, already working at the railroad yards, broad-shouldered and confident in the way that young men from small towns often are when they have steady work and a pickup truck. They married in 1988 when Jennifer was 20 and moved into a rental house on the west side of town, a single-story ranch with beige siding and a gravel driveway. Surrounded by similar houses that all seemed to blur together in their sameness. Their first child, a daughter named Melissa, was born in 1989. Their son, Tyler, followed in 1991. Jennifer stayed home with the children during those early years, stretching David's paycheck to cover rent and groceries and diapers, clipping coupons from the Sunday paper, shopping at thrift stores. Those who saw her at the grocery store or the library said she always had one child on her hip and another holding her hand, that she moved through her days with the exhausted determination of young mothers everywhere, doing what needed to be done. The house on West 4th Street was unremarkable in every way. It sat on a corner lot, with a small front yard that turned brown in winter and a backyard bordered by a chain-link fence. A swing set stood in the yard, the kind you could buy at Kmart and assemble yourself, with red plastic seats and chains that squeaked when the wind pushed them. There was a sandbox near the fence, half covered by a blue tarp weighted down with bricks. Inside, the house followed the standard floor plan of its era. Living room at the front, kitchen and dining area in the middle, 3 small bedrooms and a single bathroom down a narrow hallway. The carpet was tan and worn in the traffic patterns, and the walls were painted that particular shade of off-white that landlords favored, because it showed less dirt and required less frequent repainting. Family photographs hung in mismatched frames in the hallway, wedding pictures, baby pictures, school portraits with those generic blue backgrounds. The refrigerator in the kitchen was covered with alphabet magnets and crayon drawings held up by promotional magnets from the pizza place on South Dewey. It was a home that looked like thousands of other homes across the Great Plains, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. February 15, 1993, began like any other Tuesday morning. The temperature at dawn was 7 degrees below zero, and a thin layer of frost covered every surface outside. David Holcomb left for his shift at the railroad yards at 5:45 in the morning, the same time he left every weekday. Backing his Ford F-150 out of the driveway while the engine was still cold, exhaust visible in the frozen air. Neighbors would later tell investigators that they heard his truck start, heard it idle for a moment, heard it drive away. This detail mattered because it established his departure time with precision. Multiple witnesses, multiple accounts, all consistent. Jennifer was still in bed when he left, or so David would later say. The children were asleep in their shared bedroom at the end of the hall, Melissa in the bottom bunk, Tyler in the toddler bed against the opposite wall. The house was quiet except for the hum of the furnace pushing warm air through the floor vents. Everything was as it should be. Everything was ordinary. At approximately 8:15 that morning, Jennifer's mother, Patricia Summers, called the house. She called every Tuesday and Thursday morning at the same time, a routine they had established after Tyler was born, a way of staying connected without being intrusive. The phone rang 7 times before the answering machine picked up. Patricia left a message, her voice cheerful and ordinary, asking about the children, mentioning that she had found a winter coat at a garage sale that might fit Melissa, saying she would call back later. She hung up and thought nothing of it. Perhaps Jennifer was in the shower. Perhaps she had taken the children outside to play in the snow despite the cold. There were 100 innocent explanations. At 9:30, Patricia called again. Again, the answering machine. She left another message, this one slightly less cheerful, asking Jennifer to call her back when she got a chance. At 11, she called a third time. By now, a small worry had begun to form in her mind, the kind of worry that mothers carry like low-grade fever, present but not yet alarming. At 12:15, she called David at work. The railroad switchboard connected her to the yard's office, and someone went to find him. When he came to the phone, she asked if he had heard from Jennifer that morning. He said he had not. He said Jennifer was probably running errands, probably at the store, probably busy with the children. His voice was calm, unbothered. Patricia said she had called 4 times and gotten no answer. David said he would check on her during his lunch break. He did not sound concerned. Those who knew him said this was consistent with his personality, steady, unflappable, not given to worry. But for those who would later examine the case with the clarity of hindsight, this moment would become significant. A wife unreachable for hours, a mother-in-law expressing concern, and yet there was no urgency in his response, no suggestion that anything might be wrong. David Holcomb arrived home at 1:10 in the afternoon. He would later tell investigators that he drove his usual route, took his usual amount of time, noticed nothing unusual as he approached the house. The front door was locked, which he said was normal. He used his key to enter. Inside, the house was silent. The television in the living room was off. The breakfast dishes sat unwashed in the kitchen sink. He called Jennifer's name. No answer. He walked down the hallway to the bedrooms. The children's room was empty, the beds unmade. The master bedroom was empty as well. The bathroom was empty. He went back to the living room and stood there, trying to make sense of the absence. He would later describe this moment in great detail to investigators. The way the silence felt heavy, the way he noticed small things that seemed out of place. Jennifer's purse was on the kitchen counter, her car keys beside it. Her winter coat hung on the hook by the front door. These were not the details of a woman who had left voluntarily, who had taken the children on an errand or gone to visit a friend. These were the details of someone who had been interrupted. David called his mother-in-law. He said Jennifer was not home and neither were the children. Patricia would later recall that his voice still did not sound alarmed, but rather confused, as though he were reporting a puzzle rather than a crisis. She asked if he had checked the backyard. He said he would look. He set down the phone, walked to the back door, opened it. The yard was empty. The swing set stood motionless, the swings hanging straight down in the still air. The sandbox was undisturbed beneath its tarp. He came back to the phone and said they were not outside. Patricia said she would drive over immediately. She arrived at 1:40. Together they searched the house more thoroughly, opening closets, looking under beds, checking places that made no logical sense, but that worried people check anyway, because the alternative is standing still and doing nothing. They found nothing. At 2 o'clock, David called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department. He reported that his wife and 2 children were missing from their home. The dispatcher asked how long they had been gone. He said he did not know. The dispatcher asked when he had last seen them. He said early that morning before he left for work, around 5:45. The dispatcher noted the time of the call, 1400 hours. She said deputies would be dispatched immediately. Deputy Sheriff Michael Garrett arrived at the house on West 4th Street at 2:18. He was 29 years old, had been with the department for 6 years, and had handled missing person calls before. Mostly teenagers who stayed out past curfew or elderly residents who wandered from nursing homes. He approached this call with the standard protocols: gather information, establish timeline, determine risk level. He spoke first with David Holcomb, who was standing in the living room, hands in his pockets. Deputy Garrett would later note in his report that David appeared calm, cooperative, but not visibly distressed. The deputy asked David to walk him through the morning. David repeated what he had already told his mother-in-law and the dispatcher. Left for work at 5:45, wife and children asleep, came home at 1:10 to find them gone. Deputy Garrett asked if there had been any arguments, any reason Jennifer might have left. David said no. Their marriage was fine. Everything was fine. Deputy Garrett asked if Jennifer had friends or family she might have visited. Patricia Summers, who had been sitting on the couch listening, said Jennifer would have called, would have answered the phone when she called all morning. Deputy Garrett walked through the house, noting the purse on the counter, the keys, the coat by the door. He stepped into the backyard, saw the undisturbed snow on the ground, no footprints leading away from the house. He came back inside and radioed for additional units and for a supervisor. By 3 o'clock, the house on West 4th Street had become a crime scene, though no one used that word yet. Deputies cordoned off the property with yellow tape, not because they had found evidence of foul play, but because the circumstances suggested something more than a simple missing person case. Sergeant Thomas Blake arrived to take command of the scene. He was a veteran of the department, methodical and thorough. The kind of investigator who understood that details mattered, that cases were solved in the accumulation of small observations rather than dramatic revelations. He interviewed David Holcomb again, this time more formally, asking him to account for every minute of his morning and afternoon. David's story remained consistent. Sergeant Blake then interviewed Patricia Summers, who provided the timeline of her phone calls. He noted that the answering machine tape had been removed from the machine. When asked about this, David said he had not touched it. Patricia said she had not touched it. The tape, which would have contained the messages Patricia left throughout the morning, was never found. Clear's throat. The search for Jennifer Holcomb and her 2 children began in earnest as the winter afternoon faded into evening. By 4:30, as the temperature dropped and the light began to fail, more than 30 deputies, volunteer firefighters, and civilian volunteers had assembled in the parking lot of the elementary school, 3 blocks from the Holcomb house. Sergeant Blake divided them into teams, assigning each a sector of the neighborhood to search. They walked in lines through backyards and alleys, looking into garbage cans and storage sheds, checking parked cars and abandoned buildings. They knocked on doors, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual that morning, if they had heard anything, if they had noticed any strange vehicles in the area. Most people answered no. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Dorothy Mitchell, who lived directly across the street from the Holcomb house, said she had been awake early that morning and had seen David leave for work at the usual time, but had not seen or heard anything after that. Another neighbor, a man named Robert Chen who lived 2 houses down, said he had been shoveling his driveway around 8 in the morning and had noticed that the Holcomb house looked quiet. Curtains drawn, no lights visible, but this had seemed unremarkable at the time. As darkness fell, portable lights were brought in, and the search continued under artificial illumination. Volunteers walked the ditches along the roads leading out of town, their flashlights sweeping back and forth across the frozen ground. They searched the parking lots of shopping centers and the loading docks behind businesses. They walked the banks of the South Platte River where it curved through the southern edge of town, the water dark and sluggish beneath a skin of ice. They found nothing. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to 14 below zero, and Sergeant Blake made the decision to suspend the search until morning. The volunteers dispersed, going home to their own families, their own warm houses, carrying with them the disturbing knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, a young woman and 2 small children were unaccounted for, their fate unknown. The media arrived on the 2nd day. Camera crews from the television stations in Lincoln and Omaha set up in front of the Holcomb house, their reporters doing stand-ups with the yellow crime scene tape visible in the background. The North Platte Telegraph ran the story on the front page, "Local mother, 2 children missing." The article included photographs of Jennifer and the children, school pictures with forced smiles and combed hair, images that would soon become familiar to everyone in the region. A tip line was established at the sheriff's department, and within hours it was flooded with calls, most of them well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. Someone thought they had seen a woman matching Jennifer's description at a gas station in Ogallala. Someone else reported a suspicious van parked behind the grocery store. Someone claimed to have psychic knowledge of the family's whereabouts. Each tip was logged and investigated, and each led nowhere. The investigation began to focus more intensely on David Holcomb. This was standard procedure in cases where a family member goes missing. Statistically, the person most likely to be responsible is someone close to the victim, usually a spouse or partner. Detectives brought David in for additional questioning on the 3rd day. He came willingly, without an attorney, and sat in the interview room at the sheriff's department for more than 4 hours, answering the same questions he had answered before, maintaining the same calm demeanor. Detectives asked him about his marriage. He said it was good, they rarely argued. They were managing financially even though money was sometimes tight. Detectives asked him about his relationship with his children. He said he loved them, that he helped with their care when he was home, that being a father was important to him. Detectives asked him to take a polygraph examination. He agreed. The examination was administered the following day by a certified polygrapher from the Nebraska State Patrol. The results were inconclusive, meaning the examiner could not definitively determine whether David was being truthful or deceptive. Those who understood polygraph examinations knew that inconclusiveness was not the same as a failed test, but it was also not an exoneration. It meant simply that the machine could not read him clearly, that his physiological responses did not follow the expected patterns. Deputies returned to the house on West 4th Street with search warrants and forensic technicians. They photographed every room from multiple angles. They collected fingerprints from doorknobs and light switches. They examined the drains in the kitchen and bathroom for traces of blood. They removed sections of carpet for laboratory analysis. They dismantled the vacuum cleaner and examined its contents. They searched the attic and the crawlspace beneath the house. They inspected David's truck, taking samples from the truck bed and the interior. They looked for fibers, hairs, anything that might suggest violence or concealment. What they found was a typical family home, cluttered with the ordinary debris of daily life. Children's toys, laundry, mail, dishes. There was no blood. There were no signs of struggle. There was no physical evidence that anything criminal had occurred within those walls. Those who have ever tried to make sense of absence understand how maddening this can be. Evidence of presence is easy to find, but evidence of nothing is impossible to document. The house yielded no secrets. The search expanded beyond the immediate area. Dive teams were called in to search the river and several ponds on the outskirts of town. They dragged the murky water, feeling along the bottom with poles and hooks, surfacing with shopping carts and tires and tree branches, but no bodies. Search dogs were brought in, German shepherds trained to detect human scent, and they were given items of Jennifer's clothing to establish a scent trail. The dogs alerted in several locations around the house, but could not establish a clear direction of travel. One dog sat down at the edge of the driveway and would not move forward, which handlers interpreted as the scent trail ending at that point, suggesting Jennifer had been placed in a vehicle. This detail was noted, but could not be confirmed. Other dogs showed interest in the backyard near the fence, but did not provide a definitive indication. The handlers concluded that the ground was too frozen, and the scent too degraded by time and weather to produce reliable results. As the days stretched into weeks, the character of the investigation began to shift. The initial urgency gave way to a more methodical, grinding process of following leads and eliminating possibilities. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew the family, coworkers from the railroad yards and the Walmart, neighbors, friends from church, relatives near and far. They constructed a timeline not just of the day Jennifer disappeared, but of the weeks and months leading up to it, looking for patterns, conflicts, stresses that might have precipitated something terrible. What they heard painted a picture of an ordinary marriage with ordinary struggles. Money was tight. David worked long hours. Jennifer felt isolated at home with the children. Some people said they argued occasionally, but no more than any young couple trying to make ends meet. Some people said Jennifer had seemed tired lately, withdrawn, but attributed this to the demands of caring for two small children. No one reported any violence. No one reported any threats. No one could point to anything that explained what had happened. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the things that did not add up. David's timeline was consistent, almost too consistent, as though he had rehearsed it. His emotional affect seemed flat, disconnected, not matching the behavior of other parents they had seen in similar circumstances. When other parents lost children, they became frantic, desperate, sometimes hysterical. David remained composed, cooperative, going to work, maintaining his routines. When questioned about this, he said that falling apart would not help Jennifer and the children, that someone needed to stay strong. That panic accomplished nothing. This explanation was logical, even admirable in its way, but it felt wrong to the investigators who had seen grief before and knew its usual shapes. They could not articulate exactly what bothered them, but the feeling persisted. The media coverage intensified. Jennifer's photograph appeared on the news every night for weeks. Posters were printed and distributed throughout Nebraska and neighboring states, hung in gas stations and truck stops and post offices. "Have you seen this woman?" followed by physical description and contact information. The children's photographs appeared alongside hers, Melissa with her blonde hair and pigtails, Tyler with his wide smile and missing front tooth. The community organized vigils and prayer services. Ribbons were tied to trees and lamp posts. A reward fund was established, growing to $20,000 through donations from local businesses and concerned citizens. Despite all this attention, no credible leads emerged. It was as though Jennifer Holcomb and her children had simply vanished into the frozen landscape, leaving behind nothing but questions and the growing suspicion that the answers lay somewhere closer than anyone wanted to believe. By late April, as the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in yards and fields, the active phase of the investigation had largely concluded. The case remained open, assigned to a detective who would follow up on any new leads, but the daily searches had stopped, the volunteer efforts had disbanded, and the media had moved on to other stories. David Holcomb continued working at the railroad yards. He continued living in the house on West 4th Street, sleeping in the bed he had shared with Jennifer, walking past the children's empty bedroom every day. Those who saw him around town said he kept to himself, did not socialize, moved through his life like a man carrying an invisible weight. Some people felt sympathy for him, imagining the terrible limbo of not knowing what had happened to his family. Others felt suspicion, noting his continued presence in a house that most people would have fled. The community remained divided, uncertain, unable to move forward but unable to do anything else. The case went cold. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether to trust your instincts or dismiss them as paranoia. The years that followed Jennifer Holcomb's disappearance were a study in sustained ambiguity. David Holcomb remained in North Platte for 2 more years, maintaining his innocence, maintaining his routine, maintaining the story he had told from the beginning. He left for work, came home to find them gone, had no idea what happened. In 1995, he sold the house on West 4th Street to a family moving in from out of state, people who did not know its history and would only learn later what had occurred there. David moved to Grand Island, a town 90 miles to the east, where the railroad had transferred him to a different position. He rented an apartment in a complex near the interstate, a 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor overlooking a parking lot. He worked, came home, kept to himself. Those who knew him in Grand Island said he rarely spoke about his past, rarely mentioned that he had been married, had children. When asked, he would say only that his family was gone, and the way he said it discouraged further questions. Patricia Summers never stopped looking for her daughter and grandchildren. She could not accept that they had simply vanished, could not accept that no trace of them would ever be found. She maintained contact with the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, calling every few months to ask if there had been any developments. The answer was always the same: No new leads, no new evidence. The case remained open but inactive. She hired a private investigator in 1997, a retired police detective from Omaha named James Kowalski, who reviewed the case file and conducted his own interviews. His conclusion, delivered in a typed report that Patricia kept in a manila folder in her dining room, was that without physical evidence or eyewitness testimony, the case could not be solved through conventional investigative methods. He noted, however, that the most likely scenario was that Jennifer and the children had been killed by someone they knew, someone who had the opportunity and means to dispose of their bodies in a way that prevented discovery. He did not name David Holcomb in his report, but the implication was clear. Patricia read the report once, put it in the folder, and did not look at it again for many years. Some truths are too painful to confront directly. In Grand Island, David Holcomb began a relationship with a woman named Rebecca Tanner. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office, was divorced with no children, and had moved to Nebraska from Colorado looking for a fresh start. They met at a community barbecue in 1997, began dating casually, and by 1999 were living together in a small house they rented on the north side of town. Rebecca would later say that David was quiet, reserved, but kind to her, reliable. She said he had told her about his first family, that they had disappeared and were presumed deceased, but he did not talk about it in detail and she did not push him. Some things, she believed, were too painful to revisit. They were married in 2000 in a simple ceremony at the county courthouse, just the two of them and two witnesses pulled in from the hallway. They settled into a life that resembled normalcy: work, home, occasional dinners out, vacations to the Black Hills and Denver. Rebecca wanted children, but David said he could not go through that again, could not risk that kind of loss. She accepted this, though it disappointed her. In 2003, 10 years after Jennifer's disappearance, Rebecca became pregnant. The pregnancy was unplanned but not unwelcome. David's reaction was complicated. She would later recall. He seemed pleased but also anxious, withdrawn in ways he had not been before. He had nightmares during her pregnancy, waking in the middle of the night with his heart racing, refusing to talk about what he had dreamed. He became protective to the point of obsessiveness, insisting that Rebecca not go anywhere alone, that she call him multiple times throughout the day, that she keep the doors locked even when she was home during daylight hours. When she asked what he was afraid of, he could not articulate it. He would only say that terrible things could happen, that you could not be too careful, that the world was more dangerous than people realized. Their daughter, Emma, was born in December 2003. David held her in the hospital with tears running down his face, and Rebecca thought perhaps the birth would heal something in him, would allow him to let go of whatever haunted him. For a while it seemed that way. He was attentive with Emma, gentle, present in ways that surprised Rebecca given his earlier reluctance about having children, but the nightmares continued. Emma grew into a quiet child, observant and serious beyond her years. She started preschool in 2007, kindergarten in 2008. She drew pictures like all children draw pictures, bringing them home in her backpack to be hung on the refrigerator with magnets. Most of the pictures were unremarkable: houses with triangular roofs, smiling stick figures holding hands, flowers with improbable colors. But some of the pictures troubled her teachers. In first grade, Emma drew a picture of a family: a man, a woman, 2 children. The figures were drawn in crayon, simple and childlike. At the bottom of the page she had written in uneven letters, "The other family." Her teacher asked her about it. Emma said her father had told her about them, the family he had before, the woman and the children who went away. The teacher asked if Emma's father talked about them often. Emma said sometimes, when he thought she was asleep, She could hear him talking to himself about them. The teacher made a note in Emma's file but took no further action. Children heard things, misunderstood things, created narratives from fragments. It was not unusual. In 2009, when Emma was 6 years old, Rebecca and David's marriage began to deteriorate in ways that neither could fully explain. They argued more frequently about small things that escalated into larger conflicts: money, housework, how to discipline Emma, whether to move to a different house. David became more controlling, insisting on knowing where Rebecca was at all times, questioning her about every phone call and every errand. Rebecca felt suffocated, trapped, though she could not point to any specific incident that justified leaving. She suggested marriage counseling. David refused. She suggested they take a vacation together, just the two of them, leaving Emma with her mother for a week. David refused. The distance between them grew wider. They stopped sleeping in the same bed. They spoke to each other only when necessary. Their communication reduced to logistics and coordination around Emma's schedule. Those who have ever lived in a house that feels haunted by unspoken truth understand this particular kind of misery, the way silence can become its own form of violence. In the summer of 2011, Emma began having nightmares. She would wake screaming, calling for her mother, inconsolable for minutes at a time before she could be calmed. When Rebecca asked what she had dreamed, Emma could not articulate it clearly. She spoke of cold and darkness, of being unable to breathe, of hands pushing her down. Rebecca asked if something had happened at school, if someone had frightened her or hurt her. Emma said no. Rebecca asked if she had seen something on television that scared her. Emma said no. The nightmares continued through the fall and into winter. Rebecca took Emma to a pediatrician, who found nothing physically wrong and referred them to a child psychologist. The psychologist met with Emma for 6 sessions, using play therapy and drawing exercises to try to understand what was troubling her. In one session, Emma built a house out of blocks, placed small plastic figures inside representing a family, and then knocked the house down, scattering the figures across the floor. When asked why she had done that, Emma said, "That is what happens to families sometimes. They disappear." Rebecca confronted David that evening after Emma was asleep. She asked him what he had told Emma about his first family. He said nothing, just that they were gone. Rebecca asked if he had told Emma how they died. David said he had not told her they were dead, because officially they were missing, not dead. Rebecca said Emma was having nightmares, was clearly disturbed by something, and they needed to address it. David said children had nightmares. It was normal. She would outgrow it. Rebecca said it was not normal, that Emma's nightmares were specific and consistent and frightening. David stood up and walked out of the room, ending the conversation. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table until past midnight, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what felt increasingly like a life built on unstable ground. In March 2012, Rebecca asked David to move out. She did not file for divorce immediately, but she said she needed time to think, needed space, needed to understand what was happening in their marriage. David moved into a studio apartment across town. He saw Emma on weekends, taking her to the park and out for lunch, returning her to Rebecca by evening. During this separation, Rebecca began to go through the boxes that David had stored in the basement, things he had brought with him from North Platte years before. She found old photographs, documents, mementos. She found a newspaper clipping from 1993 about Jennifer's disappearance. She found letters from Patricia Summers, dated between 1994 and 1998, asking David to please tell her the truth about what happened, pleading with him to give her closure. Rebecca had never seen these letters before, had never known they existed. She read them sitting on the basement floor, surrounded by boxes, and felt something shift in her understanding of the man she had married. She called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department. She spoke with a detective named Sarah Ramirez, who had recently been assigned to review cold cases. Rebecca explained who she was married to, and said she had information that might be relevant. Detective Ramirez listened without interrupting, taking notes. When Rebecca finished, the detective said she would look into it and would be in touch. 3 days later, Detective Ramirez drove to Grand Island and met with Rebecca in person. They sat in Rebecca's living room while Emma was at school, and Rebecca told her everything. The nightmares David had during her pregnancy, the things Emma had said, the drawings she had made. The letters in the basement. Detective Ramirez asked if she could see the letters. Rebecca retrieved them from the basement and handed them over. Detective Ramirez photographed each one with her phone camera, documenting them as potential evidence. The case was officially reopened in April 2012. Detective Ramirez began by re-interviewing everyone who had been involved in the original investigation, reviewing the case file, looking for anything that might have been missed 2 decades earlier. She contacted Patricia Summers, who was now in her 70s and living in a retirement community in Kearney. Patricia told her everything she remembered, everything she had suspected, everything she had been afraid to say out loud. Detective Ramirez also reached out to David's coworkers from the railroad yards, both past and present. One of them, a man named Carl Henderson, who had worked alongside David in 1993, said something that caught the detective's attention. He said that in the days after Jennifer disappeared, David had asked to borrow his truck, saying his own truck was having mechanical problems. Carl had loaned him the truck for an afternoon. When David returned it, Carl noticed that the odometer showed an additional 200 miles, far more than would be needed for a trip to a mechanic. When Carl asked about it, David said he had driven around, trying to clear his head. Carl had thought it odd at the time but had not mentioned it to investigators. 200 miles would have been enough to drive from North Platte to any number of remote locations in the Sandhills, the vast region of grass-covered sand dunes that stretched across northern Nebraska. It was sparsely populated, crisscrossed by ranch roads and 2-tracks, dotted with stock ponds and dry creek beds. It was the kind of landscape where something could be hidden and never found. Detective Ramirez obtained maps and began identifying locations within a 100-mile radius of North Platte that would have been accessible in February, when the ground was frozen but not yet snow-covered enough to make travel impossible. She coordinated with the Nebraska State Patrol to conduct ground searches in several of these areas, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. The searches yielded nothing. The land had swallowed whatever secrets it held. In August 2013, Detective Ramirez arranged to interview Emma Holcomb. Rebecca gave permission for the interview, which was conducted by a specialist in child forensic interviewing, in a room designed to be non-threatening, with toys and comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Emma was 10 years old by then, old enough to articulate her thoughts clearly. The interviewer established rapport, asked about school and friends and hobbies, and then gradually guided the conversation toward Emma's family. Emma said her parents were separated, that she lived with her mother but saw her father on weekends. The interviewer asked if Emma knew about her father's first family. Emma said yes, the woman and 2 children who disappeared. The interviewer asked how Emma knew about them. Emma said her father talked about them sometimes, and she had heard her parents arguing about them. The interviewer asked what her father had said. Emma hesitated, looking uncomfortable. She said her father had told her that sometimes people go away and you never find them, that the world is full of places where things disappear. The interviewer asked if her father had said what happened to the woman and children. Emma said no, but she thought maybe he knew because he had nightmares about them and would wake up crying.